Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this episode of Trade Winds. We will talk about digital trade today, and I have two fabulous panelists with me. Penny Naas, who is President for International Public Affairs and Sustainability at UPS. And in Paris, we have Marion Jansen, who is Director at the OECD at the Trade and Agriculture Directorate, and she also has a long experience of working in WTO, ITC, and ILO. My name is Cecilia Malmström. I am a Senior Fellow at PIIE, the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Both of my guests have been contributing to a publication called 10 Wins for Digital Trade that were presented a few weeks ago at the WTO Global Forum in Geneva by Trade Experts, which is a global network of women all over the world engaged in different aspects of trade. I'll be happy to hear your comments from that publication in just a little time. So digital trade, what is that actually? We talk a lot about it, we hear a lot about it. And what are the obstacles to fully use the potential of digital trade in our economies? Well, there's not one universally accepted definition, but usually one refers to trade or commerce enabled by electronic means, by telecommunications, ITC services, covering both goods, services, banks, agriculture, manufacture, everyday apps. And digitalization, of course, in trade increases the scale, speed, and scope of the transaction. And that has changed quite considerably the way that we trade. And all this brings about questions on policy, on labor condition, on tariffs, tax collection, standards, nationally and cross-border. In 2018, before the pandemic, digital trade was estimated to more than $21 trillion, with around 1.5 billion people shopping online in different aspects. And that is at least 30% of global GDP, according to UNCTAD, the United Nations organization. And that was before the pandemic. So of course, the pandemic as well has had a large impact on our lives and opened up new possibilities for daily contacts between individuals, but also to facilitate exchange on a commercial level. And this is very much about how we reduce the costs of trade, how we facilitate the coordination of global value chains, and how we connect business and consumers. But we've seen a lot of positive advantages of this, but we have also seen that the digital cleavage between countries, within countries, between groups in countries, and between developing and developing countries, and also between gender has increased. So it is, of course, vital that companies can move data across borders, but then we have the element of privacy, of fundamental rights to be addressed. And this is just one piece of the digital landscape that is so complex and so fragmented. So we thought we're going to look a little bit on this from a US perspective, from a European perspective, but also from a global perspective, because we, of course, have rules being discussed in the European Union, in the US, globally as well, to see how we can facilitate digital trade and also address the different obstacles. So how do we achieve this? What are the main obstacles? What are the main challenges? What are the things to put on the to-do list on a short and medium-term basis? We have Penny from UPS, a big international company who, of course, are faced with these questions every day. And we have OECD, who is working to help the member countries and policymakers to identify and to propose solutions to challenges arising from digitalization. So what restrictions do you see and how can we address them on a general plan, on a general basis? So why don't you start, Marion, about the work that you in OECD are doing on this?
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank you very much for inviting the OECD to be with you here today and to discuss this important topic. Well, if you ask me what the challenges are, we see one general challenge, which is the one that this issue of digital trade is so complex for the trade community. First, probably because it was new. It's not new anymore, but it was different from our traditional way of thinking about trade. And the complexity comes with aspects like there are several interfaces to domestic regulation. And the interface between trade and domestic regulation has traditionally been something that the trade community, notably at the WTO, has found hard to tackle, to manage. So if you deal with digital trade, multiple interfaces to the regulatory, to domestic regulation, that makes it particularly difficult then. There are new themes like consumer protection. Some of you may be surprised to hear that the term consumer protection. I think even the term consumer does not appear in the traditional WTO agreements. But this is coming up in a very important way in the context of e-commerce and digital trade. New aspects, it's complex. Then there are new aspects like the interface with data flows. What are data? How to deal with data in the context of trade. And another challenge is when we look at the evolution of time, we are trying to measure what is happening to digital trade restrictiveness. We see that the digital trade has become more restrictive in recent years. So governments have increasingly introduced new measures that make it more difficult to trade. So challenging because it's a challenging topic, because of multiple interfaces with regulation, because the very new aspects like the one of data flows, and challenging because in the past years, digital trade has become more restrictive. But I do also want to say something positive, not only challenges. On the more positive side, there is already a set of legal instruments, notably at the WTO, that are relevant for digital trade, so that we can build on. I'm thinking of the GATS. I'm thinking of the Information Technology Agreement, of TRIPS. Very importantly, and that's something our OECD work has been showing, we see that different bodies are working on harmonizing regulatory aspects relevant for which digital trade. We are thinking of UNCITRAL notably, and now my voice is leaving me, 1 second. We are notably thinking of UNCITRAL, we are thinking of ISO, IEC standards, also a number of OECD instruments, for instance, the one on OECD privacy guidelines or the recommendations on cybersecurity. These are relevant for digital trade, and they are playing increasingly a role also for digital trade agreements. And very interesting, 1 out of 2 trade agreements signed since the year 2000 have digital trade provisions. So we're making progress in this space. I will leave it here. So therefore, with a message of hope, yes, there are important challenges, but we are seeing also some progress.
Thank you for this. And indeed, the complexity is why we are trying to sort of identify different aspects of this. We'll come back to a few things that you said, but Penny, UPS is of course a huge company present in large parts of the world, so digital trade is nothing new to you, but can I imagine it has accelerated during the COVID. How do you see this with the conflicts and the lack of common standards that Marion referred to?
Yeah, so thank you so much, Cecilia and Marion. Thank you so much for the introduction and for pushing through with a cold. When I think about digital trade, it's actually something that I think is nothing new to us at UPS. When I think about digital trade, and I think you outlined a definition of it very appropriately, Cecilia, at the beginning, but it's really about, continuing to try to solve a problem of getting something somebody wants from one place to the other. And digital, that's the problem you're trying to solve. And digital is the means by which you can actually accomplish it. So the problem we're trying to tackle is the same as we used to. In the old days at UPS, we started off delivering telegrams on bicycles in Seattle, Washington in 1907. And then we transitioned to delivering goods from what were new innovations at the time of department stores. So stores where you had multiple brands or multiple people selling goods to people's homes, because people couldn't get the goods on streetcars from the department store to their house. And so we would do that delivery. So when I think about what we're looking at today with digital, I think it's not new things, but it's things that, because of the velocity, because of the scale, may become different than the way the rules were written for the analog world. So again, and I'm going to go back to the old days. And Cecilia, I don't know what the equivalent is in Sweden, and Marion, I don't know what it is in Germany. But when I was a kid, you got the Sears catalog, usually in October, November, and you would spend like days circling all the toys that you wanted to get for Christmas out of the catalog. And then your parent would either write down the numbers on a form and mail them in, and then you would have stuff, either for pickup at a local store or sent to your home, or you could call a phone number. Now, it didn't work in the cross-border context because the phone number that was given was a local number. So the Canadians, and I grew up in Michigan, Canadians couldn't call to get their orders in. So there've always been these kind of challenges and complexities with regards to once you take trade and you make it cross-border. So when I think about some of the things that we're working on today and how we're trying to help our customers with this new era of e-commerce, you've got these new institutions of platforms or marketplaces, which are new. They're similar to the catalogs of old, but it's where do you go to advertise your goods in a way that's going to have the most eyeballs on it. That's customer acquisition is incredibly important, and digital provides a whole lot of new ways for you to find customers. Then you got to pay for your goods. You got to manage your inventory, you got to ship the good, and most importantly, you got to be able to take a return or deal with customer complaints. So the process is, similar, but with a whole new overlay of digital on it. So when we think about some of the obstacles that are out there that are maybe holding back some of the e-commerce and some of the digital trade that we'd like to see, I would point to a couple of things. So, trust is incredibly important. And that whole relationship is about trust. If you want to buy something, you want to make sure that you get it, and that if you get it and it doesn't work, you can send it back. And so making sure you have the means by which all of that can take place, particularly in a cross-border setting, is very important. And that is where I think governments and institutions can come in and really provide some stability. But what I think, is a little bit challenging at the moment is that things are moving very slowly on this, and the pace of business is moving much faster than, in some cases, we're seeing some of the rules being written. And so that trust is having to be validated in other ways. I think the work that Marion and others have going on in international institutions to really set some of those guidelines and foundational work is incredibly important. But we can dig into that more in terms of some of the specific things that I think would help us contribute more to the digitalization, further digitalization of what's going on in the world. So I'll stop there, Cecilia, for more comments for later.
Thank you, and thank you for taking these very concrete examples. Of course, it's so much more complex today, and you don't need only trust between the company and the one who buys the toy or whatever it is. It also, on an international level, you need to have trust between the countries and between the different institutions, and you need to have standards, and there's a lack of interoperability as well, maybe not in one big company, but between companies. And this is also something that I know that the OECD has been looking at and sort of suggest how you move on with creating more strategies for not only trust but also for this interoperability and standards. Is this something you could elaborate a little bit about, Marion, if your voice is okay?
Yeah, let's see how long my voice works. And so far, no digital solution for that. Yes, I think coming back to the OECD role is very much one right now in this space of working on these standards that could make the domestic rules speak more to each other, but you will find it interesting that these kind of standards are not set in the trade committee. This is being discussed in other committees. So when I mentioned the recommendations on cybersecurity or recommendations on consumer protection, they are being dealt with in different parts of the House, reflecting that they fall at the national level in different ministries than the trade ministry. And that's where the difficulty comes from. If you want to allow for trade or digital trade, each country will want to make reference normally to its own, let's say, cybersecurity rules or its own privacy rules or its own consumer protection rules. But if all these rules are different at the domestic level, then I would expect that for Penny's company, this becomes a nightmare because she has to deal with multiple sets. And it's multiple sets. So I'm only mentioning 3 areas of rules. There are many more. If they all differ across countries, it makes it very difficult to make sure you abide to all these rules at the same time. It would even be difficult for Penny's company that is a multinational, but small and medium-sized enterprises would have no idea how to deal with this big diversity of national regulations. So this is why these sets of recommendations that are being developed in places like the OECD, but also, as I mentioned, in UNCITRAL, for instance, it's the UNCITRAL instrument on e-signatures or e-contracts. That's probably one of the international standards most referenced in the digital trade provisions that I've just mentioned to you. And that's important. So countries say, we allow digital trade among each other, and we accept e-signatures if each country abides to the UNCITRAL e-signature approach. That makes things easy. So these other regulatory spaces are very important. It's very important that they exist. But what we are currently seeing is that these regulatory spaces evolve a bit in a non-orchestrated way. And that makes it maybe a bit slow, but that's what we consider to be closer to a market behavior of regulation also. But that makes it potentially a bit slow. There is no clear way which is the standard you should pick. When do we know when a standard or a regulation harmonized at the international level on a particular topic exists, and from where will it be coming? But again, coming back to the positive side of things, we see a lot of international activity in that space, and we see a lot of proactivity on the trade policy side of picking up that activity at the international regulatory space. So there is not an attempt to reinvent wheels in the context of trade agreements, but to make sure that all these different systems build on each other. So I understand we are still not in an ideal world. We're listening to Penny, but and that's also how we see it. But we like to have we consider that there is a positive movement going on.
Yes, slow but steady. But the importance is also, as you say, that there's not too much differences between the different frameworks that are being elaborated, because you do some recommendations in the OECD. We have the WTO e-commerce negotiation, which involved about 90 countries of the world, also trying to set standards on e-commerce, e-signatures, e-contracts, how to deal with spam, and so on. And then we have, you mentioned also the bilateral trade agreements, where there are chapters on digital trade, try to facilitate and set common rules. We have between Singapore, New Zealand, and Chile, they have just concluded a digital economy partnership agreement, where they also try to regulate everything from e-invoice to paperless trade and data protection, consumer protection, and so on. And this must be a nightmare for a small company to try to, if you export to several different parts of the world. But a big company, even if you have more resources, it's also hard to see if they are not compatible, all these rules. Where does that leave us? So how do you deal with these issues in UPS, Penny?
So I would say one thing is we just went through an incredible period with COVID, where we had a lot of things were waived or changed to allow goods to move during that period. So we saw countries put in place flexibilities to move the goods that needed to move during the past couple of years. We also saw a tremendous explosion of digital services being provided. The platform we're on today, Cecilia, very few people, I was dealing with Zoom as kind of a new technology before COVID hit. And then of course, all of us became experts in these platforms. So we had this tremendous period of change and opportunity to show the world that you didn't need paper invoices, that electric signatures and electric chops in Asia were not only possible, but worked. And I think the thing that concerns me a little bit, some things have stuck. And, I think we've seen that certain things, countries accepted that certain things could happen because of the change and the fact that they had to do it because of COVID. But you've also seen some things snap back. And I don't think that that's been, that's not enormously helpful for either the countries nor for others in terms of looking for some of these digital efficiencies that can replace paper. Replacing paper invoices is not only important for, efficiency, transparency, et cetera. It's also great for the planet. And with COP27 going on right now, you can save millions and millions, not only of trees, but carbon from moving to and allowing e-invoices to move around the world. So there's just a lot of cases for it that exist. And I totally agree with Marion that there's work that has to go on at a pace and with acceptance of international standards, because that is obviously a lot easier for all of us to deal with at the end of the day. But at the same time, I'm a little concerned that we haven't seen that wholesale embrace of things post-COVID that were clearly worked and brought a lot of efficiencies, whether it be customs, whether it be payments, whether it be other things. And that remains, I think, a little bit of an area of opportunity that we could, hopefully accelerate moving forward because of all those great examples we have from the past couple of years.
Yeah, that would indeed make a lot of sense. COVID was terrible in many ways, and far too many people died. But it had positive effects. I agree with you. 3 years ago, I never heard the Zoom before, and now we're all Zoom connecting all over the world, which brings fantastic possibilities. So of course, we need to make sure that also the society in general and the companies can take full benefits of that. And how do we avoid then that we build up parallel standards? That is, of course, a key issue as well, because all these agreements that are being dealt, I think most of them, they're trying to stick to the basics that already exist in WTO, for instance, but they are old and they are written in a world where we didn't have this digital speed in our transactions. So there is, of course, a risk that we create parallel systems, which would be really bad for the economy as a whole, and especially for small companies who are trying to export goods or services out there and trying to navigate which are the rules today. And then you have customs, and then you have labor conditions, and you have payments, and the list is rather long, actually. Are you involved from OECD is obviously, but Penny, from a company position, are you involved in trying to frame or to push those rules so that they become, actually working in the real world, not only for you, but also for business in general?
No, absolutely. And so, as you've referenced, we've been looking at this issue primarily through the eyes of our customer. So we're a large company. We're the largest customs broker around the world. We can figure out the complexity. And in fact, that's what we do on a day-to-day basis for our customers. But it is a challenge for SMEs who, may get an order that comes from a country that, they hadn't thought of. And how do they get that good to that country? What are the consumer protection rules? How do they even quote a price? What are the Incoterms that they need to be thinking about? There's things like this that I think arise in that context. And so we've been focused, and where we've been putting a lot of our energy and effort has been on the customs piece. Obviously, that's an important area for us, but whether it be, moving to electronic submissions, whether it be figuring out how to process the payment of duties and taxes in a way that's better. We've seen very real life examples from Brexit in particular and other things where it's great that the duties got waived, but people forgot that when you started to move goods between Europe and the UK, they were now going to be covered by VAT. And so you have things like that. How do you facilitate those payments? How do you deal with all of that? How do you deal with the very practical issue of returns? So again, a huge issue with very, very live examples coming out of Brexit where people bought things and then when it came time to return it, they may have paid something on the way in, which was tax or a duty, and then they want to return it. And how does that get processed? It becomes a big impediment to people's ability to do e-commerce if you don't have the returns piece figured out. And that's something that's got a very large customs component to it in order to, as well as a tax component to it in terms of how you process it. So these are some of the things that we're trying to explore with governments around the world. And we're working in both regional agreements and regional blocks like APEC, where, there's a great chapter on these in DEPA with regards to customs. There's work going on the JSI on e-commerce at the WTO. So those are areas that I think are areas of opportunity, and they're incredibly important, not only to SMEs, but also diverse SMEs. Still, it's the number one issue that's flagged is customs and payments. Those are the top issues that SMEs are flagging, and in terms of their ability to do cross-border. So it's an area that we would love to see more work in and more work done on.
Marion, is the OECD a partner in this? Can you help?
Well, we on
you
that
are already.
We are, yes, well, we are above all on the what happens at the border side. That's something we are tracking in our trade facilitation index, notably, where we have been following to which extent our process is being made digital, because there I think the evidence is clear that digitalization of border processes facilitates trade and benefits consumers, and digitalization of border processes is good for female traders because it has been proven to make it easier for them to get their produce or services through the border. So yes, this is something we are following, and it is, as Penny said, this is the one area where we observed during the COVID-19 that there was a real progress in the sense that very rapidly a number of governments moved towards digitalization of processes, because it was very obvious that there where that option existed, it was easier to continue conducting business during this difficult COVID period, where it was, because of lockdowns or of illnesses, sometimes difficult to man the border and to deal with paper processes. So this is an aspect where we are active. Now, maybe coming back to this interface between trade and the regulatory part, and maybe going back to Penny's example, talking about the past, when we look at another area where the trade world deals with regulatory interfaces, one example is the area of food. So where we all we are happy to import or export foodstuff, but consumers would like to trust the food and would like therefore to know that it is safe. So in order to deal with this, the WTO has an agreement, the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement. That agreement makes reference to an international standard setting body, the Codex Alimentarius. And that agreement says, if you apply a food safety standard that has been agreed in the Codex Alimentarius, then you are doing something that is good and it is not considered to be an impediment for trade. So there's an encouragement of using international standards. Now the lawyers in the audience will get upset because I probably simplified things too much, but there is this interface between openness and international standards. So, but one important difference was that the standard setting body existed before the WTO was created. So there was already international collaboration. Now in the digital trade world, we have the difficulty that many countries didn't have, when we started trading, any national regulation. Now, increasingly, we have that regulation being put in place. There's privacy protection, cybersecurity protection, that I think there's agreement we need them. And then on top of it, you need to have somehow an international agreement on how these different rules talk to each other. But the WTO already exists. And the digital trade rules are being developed. So we have a trade body now, but the regulatory space is far behind and has to catch up very rapidly. So again, I say what is positive is that we see so much activity, but what is complex is that this takes so many different shapes. So I think you made reference, Cecilia, to the agreement between Australia and Singapore. Now, that agreement makes reference to many things that you typically don't deal with in a trade agreement, like submarine cables. Yes, submarine cables are important for digital trade because of transmission for data. But there we have a marriage of trade issues with infrastructure issues that is new. Now, I find this intellectually fascinating, but given that we need to build trust and create security, it's also unsettling how new and how different these kind of arrangements are. The deeper the digital economic partnership agreement that with New Zealand, that involves New Zealand, Chile and Singapore, I think, also deals with issues of logistics. So again, goes much more into the business aspects of the digital trade than a typical trade agreement would do. So we are seeing a new family of collaborative arrangements, initiatives, agreement, call them what you want, popping up. Very good to see so much dynamic. Interesting to see that there's quite a bit of that coming from the Asia Pacific region. But really, all trade negotiators, in particular in the digital e-commerce space, they have a lot. I would expect. Well, I know they have a lot on their plate because they have to keep track of this. But a lot of movement, but a lot needs to be achieved still to make these worlds speak to each other and to reach this safe, secure, trustworthy, but smooth and easy digital trade that we would all like to see.
Yes, and in addition to this, to further complicate, you of course have the issue of personal trust. Not only that you can send back a product that wasn't up to your expectation or there was something wrong with it, but also the fact that so many companies also collect personal data. Sometimes just for statistics, but otherwise, personal data is really something that is important in this. So customers or citizens need to know that these are treated with respect. And in the EU, there is this GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. In the US, I think it is in Congress. It hasn't been adopted yet. There's another of these acronyms, ADPPA. American Data Privacy and Protection Act, which, when I read the analysis, is rather comparable to the GDPR in Europe. It's not as ambitious, but it gives more or less the same protection on an individual level, and it also enables the individual citizen to make complaints if there are some things that has not worked. And this would, of course, be good if these two regulations, once it is adopted in the US, and we'll see what happens now after the elections, if they could talk to each other. And then, of course, all the other countries have similar agreements as well. And this is to protect citizens and consumers, absolutely. But still, they could also be that too much regulation hampers innovation. So how do you square that circle? Maybe you don't have the answers, but this must be something that especially UPS have been looking at.
Yeah, well, data, we're an unusual data mover. So every package that crosses border has data that goes in advance and has data that goes afterwards as we move the good around the world. People want to be able to track their goods. It's becoming even more important as we think about global supply chains, global value chains. So if you look at some of the bottlenecks and some of the issues in the past couple of years, that's because there's not a whole lot of transparency that's out there with regards to supply chains, because it's a bit fractured in terms of moving from, raw material acquisition to manufacturing to, potential movements to final movements. So there's a lot of steps in that process, and they're not all linked at the moment. So the data issues are really important, and I think data is at the heart of digital trade. So I see one of the questions in the chat was asking, how to define digital trade. And I guess I think of it in like 3 ways for my company. So one is certain things we used to move because they were a good have become a service. So, we don't ship a whole lot of DVDs or CDs around the world anymore. Most people have subscribed to music services, and so now that's just transmitted digitally. People used to travel for conferences, now we get on Zooms. So there's that kind of digital trade that I think, comes up, and there's questions around that. Then there is the question that you ask about in the chat about things that are acquired using digital means, but then are, need to move in the real world. So they need to be paid for, they need to move. And how do you enable that trade? And then the third way I think of it is that movement of goods. Now, when you think about data, there is, I think, some alignment, but some differences globally around data. And I think that sits at the crux of the issues going on in the JSI on e-commerce, that lack of agreement with regards to, is data a national security issue? Is data a human right? Or is data something that, is in the individual hands to decide what they do and don't want to share, a more laissez-faire approach? And I think that disagreement with what data is something that still remains unresolved and creates those impasses at the moment. So what do we end up dealing with? We end up with a world with data localization, where we have to set up different servers in countries around the world. That creates not only cost, but vulnerabilities. We have to deal with, cross-border data flows that may or may not be restricted. And I think it's important to think about the things that should be tracked and that are sensitive, and the stuff that isn't, because there are now more connected devices in the world and more data that they're transmitting on a day-to-day basis. And it's just going up exponentially. I'm not sure that data always needs to be protected, but there is some other data that may need to be protected. And having that agreement and finding those pathways forward is important. But I think it's something that almost needs to rise up via the regional agreements or some of the other agreements, just because the values that we have don't necessarily align at the moment on how we think or treat data. And that is what is creating the issues. And I personally am struggling with what are the mechanisms by which to come up with common sense of principles and goals when you don't have common values that underpin those.
Yeah, that's of course a huge issue. Do you have any comments to this, Marion?
Yeah, I think when it comes to the values, it is our impression that we have, I don't know, I don't feel comfortable with what value in particular, but necessarily, but we feel that, let's say, the themes that are of relevance, that there is a convergence, that we have been seeing a convergence over the past years. So the fact that cybersecurity matters, for instance, that's we see this coming up pretty much globally now. Also the issue that consumer protection matters. So 10 years ago, that may not have been as clear as it is now. So it is increasing, it's very clear in our view that at least OECD members, but we think that's broader than OECD members, that there is a need to find a balance. Now, where that balance lies, that's where there are differences, and also how to implement that balance. And that's, there have been traditionally differences across countries. Let me go back to this food safety issue. And Cecilia, you may know this better than I do. The precautionary principle for food safety. There is Oh, there are very deep-rooted differences between the United States and the European Union there. So maybe we have an opportunity, because the digital theme is not as old as the eating of food. So maybe those differences cannot get as strong and deep roots. But yes, there will be differences. But at the same time, there is a real desire, and we see this coming through increasingly, a real desire to converge. Allow me to make 2 points. One of internal interest, we organize at the OECD in December a ministerial meeting of digital ministers. So the issue, this is about digital policy, but there will be cross references to the trade world. And that's one of the also the aspects, the challenges we are facing, that it's different ministries dealing with this issue. And if you talk digital trade, being from a digital ministry, you look at this from a different way than if you come from the trade ministry. A second point, maybe with a question to Penny, is the current increased emphasis on national security, I would consider that a change of the past 2 or 3 years in trade more generally. Is this, how do you think this is going to affect the discussions around digital trade, and notably about how data are handled? It is my impression that some of the recent US legislation is taking a bit of a different stance when it comes to where data should be kept and how open data flows should be than we had seen from a country like the United States in the past. So I'm a bit concerned. I do think that there may be a bit of a move in a direction that becomes more protectionist when it comes to data because of national security concerns.
Well, obviously you don't write the rules of the US, Penny, but if you have any comments to that, please feel free.
So, I mean, I would put national security, Marion, I think in a broader category too, with digital services of, maybe this is too broad of a bucket, but I think about, as we move forward with digital services, there's questions of fairness that are arising. And some of those manifest themselves in protectionist measures. But, you know, intellectual property is an area where, you know, in the digital space, we want to keep, is an important element for some, that if you're going to put your goods out there in the digital space, you want to make sure that they're protected, that there's norms there around that. Otherwise, you'll keep it back, right? I feel like, as well as we move forward with more things, particularly things in the services space, the transition from a good to a service, you think about, you know, the things that have preserved fairness in the past, whether it be, you know, anti-dumping countervailing duty laws, whether it be dispute settlement, whether it be some of the other things out there that some would consider level playing field type issues, whether it be subsidies, whether it be a lot of these issues, whether it be, you know, now national security issues. It's the one area where I think services are less equipped to deal with some of these issues than goods. So some of those rules are very clearly written in the goods space. Intellectual property, unfair trade rules, subsidy rules, really, I think, much clearer in both bilateral, regional, WTO agreements, how those apply to goods. But you start to take some of these issues and apply them to services. And, you know, that's an area that I just think is extremely complicated, so largely has not been addressed, but will become more and more important, and will be, I think, things that will become national security, subsidies, investments, etc. You know, there's not a lot of ways to restrain that using traditional trade rules, and it's an area that's extremely complicated to deal with in that space, and I think probably requires being looked at in other fora. But you see competition law then coming in, you see taxation coming in as substitutes for the fact that we can't deal with it using other means. So I don't know if that gets exactly at your point, Marion, but I think that there's, you know, that is an area where there are, it's great. We're working through the e-signatures piece. You know, I think we've seen some very interesting examples in the past week about digital identity and confirmation of digital identity on some large technology platforms. But I think these are all really fascinating issues that get woven into all of this, and like you said, become very complex. And I think are areas that we're going to have to look at more in the future to ensure that the world we're setting up, still complies with a lot of the things, some of the values, some of the principles that apply in the goods, the more traditional goods space. And I love your agriculture example, because I think that that's an important one in terms of how we've incorporated that in the food space.
Mm. Well, this geopolitization of digital trade is certainly a complex area, as you say. Maybe we'll come back to that in a future episode of trade winds. I'm not sure that Europeans will start buying chlorinated chicken digitally from the US, and the Americans will start buying French blue cheese from the US because of this. But you're absolutely right. I mean, we need these kind of agreed, accepted international conventions and tools in order to move forward. I wanted to come back to something that you have both touched upon, and there's also a question in the Q&A box about this, about women in digital trade, because we have seen that during the pandemic, women has to a larger extent than men were unemployed. Their companies, who are usually smaller companies, have had tougher times, and that is, of course, has increased the gender cleavage. But also we see that many women, when they do trade, especially international trade, they tend to be involved in smaller companies, and they can benefit largely if it facilitates the rules and the standards, so that they can work from all over the world with joint standards and so on. And this is something also where the discrimination that is there also can be reduced, according to some research. And I know that UPS has done some research on small companies and women, and also that the OECD is looking at this, and you both refer to this in this Trade Express publication from earlier this autumn. So would you like to say a few things about that, also to respond to one of the questions here from the group, and then I'll bring up some more questions, but we start with that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to start, Marion, if you want. Just briefly, so we've done a ton of work on how to make trade more inclusive, and I think one of the important elements of digital trade and what we're talking about today is how do you make sure that as we're building all these new rules, you're incorporating, you're making sure that it's inclusive by design. And so there's been some great work at the WTO on domestic regulation, where there was a provision included, specifically prohibiting discrimination against women in the granting of licenses or professional qualifications. That I think was, great, and a good step. I think there's more that can be done to ensure that the rules that we're drafting and we're writing are by their nature more inclusive. And it's not that old trade rules used to just use the term man or men, but it was that the ways in which they were executed didn't necessarily, they weren't necessarily as inclusive as they could be. And there's more specific examples about tariff codes and things like that we can get into, but I just think that that's one point. I think the point I'd like to touch on, though, Cecilia, is, the skills training. So what we saw during the pandemic, 97% of SMEs that are on the internet export. The ability to export is much higher if you're internet enabled. That has different meanings in different parts of the world. There's certain parts of the world where it's mobile technology, less internet-based technology that's really driving this, and where we see a lot of it. But what's really important is the skills training and making sure that you're helping SMEs and diverse SMEs skill up in ways that allow them to take advantage of digital means. And that training needs to be where they are, where they're, needs to be done in a way that works for diverse segments of the population, and takes into account some of the social things that are going on in their respective lives, so that you're really hitting the targets in terms of where you do the training. So we've trained 5,000 women entrepreneurs in the past 2 years, And it's really been a kind of hand-to-hand combat, getting in, setting up training programs, working with people, really hand-holding in a lot of cases. It's been very impactful. A lot of the women, come in and learn. Some go on to export. Some decide to wait a little bit because it's a challenge they're not quite ready for. But the skilling of women entrepreneurs is an incredibly important part of this, as well as the capacity building piece of it.
Indeed. Marion, I know that OECD also has a lot of statistics on this, and that you've also produced some work, comparative work between the member countries as well.
Yes, but above all, we contributed a quick win to this recent 10 quick wins document on digital trade that the trade experts generated this document, and our quick win was on bringing women into digital trade, what one could do. Let me make reference to a few recommendations we gave there. So the first one I already alluded to before. We encourage governments to promote the use of digital tools in trade, in particular at the border. And to give you an example why, a border passing is a place where traditionally you had to pay taxes or you had to pay something, you had to get stamps. And in that moment, you have an interaction. In the past, you had an interaction with an individual, and that individual could tell you how much money you had to pay and whether you get a stamp or not. In the past, if the person who needed the stamp or needed to pay was a woman, and the person deciding was a man, that made it very often difficult for the woman to get her products to the border. And there are countries where worse thing happens than high prices or not getting the stamp. There is proof of violence against women being used in order to facilitate border crossings. So this sounds very old-fashioned and down-to-earth in a session talking digital trade, but that's simply what has been going on at the border. Now, making these processes digital facilitates trade so much for women. You can even, if you think that makes it easier, transform yourself into a man. You take from my first name Marion, you take the N away, and I become a Mario. And I wouldn't care if that makes my life easier to get my products to the market and to gain money. I would be happy to do that. So digital trade, there's evidence on this. Digitalization of border processes makes it easier for women to get their goods to the border. Let's support digitalization. Yes. Women have less access to the internet. Yes, women have less skills in IT technologies. This is something that needs to be addressed, but that's not something for trade negotiators to do. On the trade side, this is what we can do. What also can be done on the trade side, as part of the e-commerce work program at the WTO, there is a technical assistance, a capacity building part of this. Build the strengthening of digital tools of female traders into those programs as part of strengthening their capacity to deal with digital tools. And last but not least, coming back to Penny's point, making rules more gender friendly, make sure that women are involved in the negotiations, also the discussions at the national level on what the digital trade rules or what the digital regulations should look like. That's going to be very important forward to make our life as data crunchers easier, make the data available, and support us in making more gender-specific analysis. Yes, we are active in that space, but the data situation continues to make that rather difficult.
Thank you for that. That's very concrete advice. We are running out of time almost, but there's one question also in the Q&A box, and one that I wanted to lift, and that is the cooperation. I know that you don't represent Europe as OECD, but Marion, because the OECD is much broader than Europe, but there is something that was created a little bit more than a year ago, 1.5 years ago, called the Trade and Tech Council, which is a forum where lots of working groups, but it's a forum where ministers and commissioners in the EU and the US meet to discuss a variety of issues. And they will meet again in just 2 weeks. And of course, digital and standards and digital trade is discussed in this. And there are also efforts. They have established some sort of strategic standardization information mechanism to promote and to defend international standards in trade activities. Now, this is work in progress. We don't know what will come out of this, but at least they are discussing, and the aim is, of course, to facilitate and to avoid double standards. If you look at this, what would be, to sum up, what would be your recommendation that they deal with when it comes to facilitating digital trade between Europe and the US? If they could, on a short-term basis, we could send them some recommendations for the work that will begin, the meeting that will begin now in just 10 days, I think, or 2 weeks.
Oh, well, Cecilia, good to leave so little time to answer that difficult question. Now, it's not the only initiative, right? There's also the EU-India Trade and Technology Council.
Absolutely,
there is the US-Japan Competitiveness and Resilience Partnership, and that's expanding on this family of new types of collaborations that I just mentioned on. So there's these new types of collaborations. I spoke about them very positively in the beginning, but they bear a risk. They could become exclusive. So maybe my advice, and that's a general advice, coming from our trade policy background, if you do something in a smaller group, make sure that others can enter, that it remains open. And now that's potentially not that easy if you're dealing with technical standards, because you can set a standard in such a way, or also in other of the regulatory areas that we mentioned, you can set them in such a way that you already know or preempt or potentially make it more difficult for others to join. Cecilia, Europe went through a difficult phase where we couldn't even agree on the color of the number plates of cars. So making these things inclusive is not straightforward, but as a multilateralist, and we are multilateral at the OECD, that's the advice I would give. Proceed in a way, yes, it's easier in a small group to find agreement, but do it in a way that remains open for others to join.
Penny?
So I think, Cecilia, I'd love your perspective on this, but I think, the one thing that I like about the Trade and Technology Council and other things is that they're forward-looking. And so what I've always found in the US-EU relations is that it's much easier to talk about emerging issues and come up with agreed common standards than it is to try to deal with issues that are closed or that have been in place and have laws that are there. So I'm encouraged by what I'm hearing about AI potentially as a deliverable and some agreed principles around artificial intelligence. That's actually an important thing for our trade. There's a lot of trade that I think is going to rely on artificial intelligence moving forward. And so while I'm not deeply in the ethical aspects of it, I am deeply in the practical aspects of how you can use AI moving forward in the future. So things like that, and I think some of the other things that Marion and I have touched on today, would all be important areas where the US and the EU can really set a common path forward on some of these issues in a way that's more constructive than addressing some of the old, longer-standing issues that just take an incredible amount of energy versus the outcome. So,
yes, no, thank you for that. I think that is very true, that it's easier to agree on standards that just emerge or that we can see coming further because you don't have the traditional methodology or your different systems on how to address this. And of course, if the EU and the US can agree, it's a good thing. But then there's a lot of other countries in the world as well. So make sure that we don't create new parallel system, but that we are as inclusive as possible. So with this, there's so much to discuss, and everything you say raises new questions. And I know there are lots of questions in the Q&A books as well. We try to address some of them. But Penny Naas, thank you so much for being with us. Marion Jansen, I hope your cold gets better and that you can get some rest. Thank you so much for sharing, and to all of you who tuned in, good afternoon, good evening, good night. Thank you so much, and welcome back in December. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.